Hello, everyone. Welcome from wherever you're joining us from. I know we have attendees coming from all over. And thank you for being here for today's webinar, New Product Forecasting Strategies for Success. My name is Sabina Kadar, and I'll be your moderator today. We'll start the webinar shortly, but first I'm just going to go over a couple logistics. So today's webinar presentation is going to run approximately 50 minutes, and then we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. During the webinar, you can submit questions using the Q&A function on your screen at any time. So please, as the questions come to you, go ahead and put them in. I'll be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar, and we'll compile a list for Q&A at the end. Now, we also will take questions that are submitted during the Q&A session itself. We'll do our best to address as many questions as we can during this 1 hour allotted for the webinar, but if we do run out of time before we get to your question, don't worry. You'll receive a follow-up email after the webinar concludes. We also will be recording this webinar and we'll email you a link to the video sometime next week when it's available for on-demand viewing. Now you can actually find a full archive of all of our past webinars on both the Forecast Pro website as well as the Forecast Pro YouTube channel. These are all free and they're a great way to catch up on any past webinars you may have missed. So if you haven't already checked out the archive, I highly recommend it. It's got a lot of really great forecasting education content. So now I'll hand it over to Eric Stellwagen and Sarah Darren so that they can introduce themselves and kick off today's webinar, New Product Forecasting Strategies for Success.
Okay, well, thank you, Sabina. My name is Eric Stellwagen, and as the slide says, I am a co-founder of Business Forecast Systems, which is the company that created Forecast Pro. I basically spent my entire career in the area of business-oriented forecasting. I've enjoyed it quite a bit, and I've had the opportunity to go into a lot of different companies and observe how they approach forecasting and how they solve some of their forecasting challenges. And that's important actually, because forecasting is not just mathematics. You know, there's not a right answer. It combines quantitative methods along with judgment and empirical knowledge about what works. And today's topic, which is new product forecasting, that is particularly true. So new product forecasting is exceedingly challenging. Of all the types of forecasting, it is the most challenging. And so we'll try to provide some guidance on and tips and tricks on how to proceed when forecasting new products. With me today, I have a co-presenter, and I will let her introduce herself.
My name is Sarah Darren. So I'm a combination data scientist, statistician, engineer, and really product manager here at BFS. But my primary background really is statistics and analytical consulting. So I've had the opportunity to see lots of different uses of data from a wide range of industries, and have had the opportunity to be involved in many product launches and generated lots of new product forecasts. So with that, let's talk about new product forecasting. So with no further ado, let's get started.
So here is our agenda for today. And what you'll see is that the webinar is really kind of organized to consider different types of new products. And then for each type of new product, the approaches that we use to help us forecast. So you can see that we're going to be talking about replacement products and product line extensions. That's one type of new product. We'll be talking about products that are new to the company. And we'll also be talking about products that are new to the world. Before we can, how do we forecast demand for something that never existed before? We don't have historic demand, so we're not going to be able to use that. There aren't other companies that have sold this thing, so we don't have any comparable products that we can base it on. and it's going to be difficult. So again, the presentation will be organized along these types. We'll look at each type, and then we will flesh out different methods that can be used for each type. We will summarize it at the end, and then we'll go into questions and answers. Okay, so again, our first topic will be replacement and product line extensions, and Sarah's going to enlighten us on that.
Thank you, Eric. So, as Eric mentioned, we're going to start off with what is probably the easiest category, replacements and line extensions. The reason that it really is the easiest is while you have limited data, you do have some data from existing or discontinued products that you can leverage. What are some of the approaches that you might want to consider? Judgment and market research. Judgment and market research are always going to be important in new product forecasting. Essentially, all product launches probably are starting with market research to help define the size of the market and assess potential demand. Judgment is important in forecasting always as well, but it's particularly important for new products since you do have limited data. When you have limited data, that means you need to use more judgment. The role of judgment in forecasting is actually important enough that we have done entire webinars dedicated to just this topic. Another really important approach is product mapping, also known as item supersession. The idea is that when you introduce replacement products, you expect the demand patterns and volume to be pretty similar to the demand for the predecessor product. In a way, it's a continuation of demand for the predecessor product. Because it's new, your replacement product has limited demand history or maybe no history at all. When you have a short data history, you are really limited in terms of what types of forecasts you can use. You really can't use a seasonal model if you don't have enough demand history. The idea here is that you can create a forecast history, a longer forecast history, by really combining the demand from a predecessor product with the new product demand, if it exists, to create this forecast history. For a replacement product, this may be as simple as just merging the old product's history with the new product's history, so just a one-to-one mapping. More complex mappings certainly do exist, and they exist because they are sometimes needed when you have multiple SKUs transitioning into a single SKU or one SKU transitioning into multiples, and line extensions also can require a more complicated mapping. So in terms of visualizing what's going on here, in this example, we have an old product or predecessor product. We have demand history that is ending at a certain point in time. We launched a new product. And we do, in this case, have some demand history, but not a whole lot. What we're going to do is we're going to combine these two histories into a single forecast history, which is now long enough to generate a more stable, more appropriate forecast. Let's take a look at how that works. What we're looking at here is what we call the bakery data. So those of you who have attended webinars before have probably seen this data set before, but it looks a little bit different now. You can see that below the total bakery, we have cakes and we have muffins as always, but we now also have discontinued cakes. So it's a little bit of a different data set. It's a data set that's actually installed with a track V7 called Product Mapping Tutorial Historic Data. But the general idea here is that we have some discontinued SKUs. For example, we have butter cake SKU 1. Product sales ended in June 2020. And at that point, it was replaced by this SKU 2. So if we look at Food King here, you can see that starting in July 2020, we started sales for that. And you can see that we only have a year of demand history. And because we only have a year, we don't have enough data to produce a seasonal forecast. So we have this flatline forecast for a seasonal product, and that is certainly not what we want. What we would like to do here is we would like to map the demand history from Food King Butter Cakes SKU 1 into the Food King Butter Cake SKU 2. To do that in Forecast Pro, you want to go to the Forecasting tab, and you can actually do this both interactively in Forecast Pro, as we're going to walk through, but we also do support reading in Excel files that just lay out the mappings and will do it automatically. If you're doing product mappings on a regular basis or a lot of product mappings, it probably is going to be a more efficient way of creating these product mappings. Back to the interactive method. When we open up this dialog box, you'll see that we take over the graph right here because we want to let you be able to visualize the forecast history. The product that we are mapping to is Butter Cakes 2 and Food King, and that is selected in the navigator here. And now what I'm going to want to do is select my predecessor product. So I'm going to select Butter Cakes SKU 1 and Food King. And you can see when I did that, the graph changed, and you now see this proposed forecast history. Forecast Pro is visualizing for you what that forecast history is going to look like if this is your selection. This is what I want, so I'm going to hit commit. And when I hit exit, the graph goes back to normal, except we now see forecast history added into the graph. And more importantly, you can now see that our forecast is a seasonal forecast and is a much better forecast. So that's a quick example of how product mapping works in Forecast Pro. We do have tutorials on this available on our tutorial website, and we have some videos. We encourage you to take a look at those if you want some more details on how product mapping works in Track. Another approach for forecasting replacement products or line extensions is top-down forecasting. The idea is that we have new products, line extensions, and products being phased out as SKUs, but they all fall within the same product group. By focusing on this product level, this group level forecast, and then allocating it down into the SKUs that are moving in and out of the group, you can often generate much better forecasts, both at the group level and at the SKU level. And that's because the group level data is higher volume, more structure, has a longer demand history, so it can produce a better forecast. Let's take a look at how that works in Track. So what we're looking at here is cold medicine, but what we're really going to focus on is the cough syrups. When you look at the cough syrup demand history, you can see, as expected, very seasonal, highest demand in the winter months when colds are certainly more prevalent. As we dive into the SKUs that make it up, you can see that there are different sizes and there are different flavors, and there's a lot of discontinued items. This one's discontinued, as you can tell from the gray square here. And when you get into the live items, you have a lot of very short data history. So here you have maybe 8 months, here you only have 2 months. By default, what Forecast Pro is going to do is it's going to generate forecasts at this end item level using the SKU level demand history, and then it is going to aggregate up those item level forecasts to the group level and then into the total as well. So let's take a look at the forecast here. We have a flat line, which pretty much when you only have 2 data points, a flat line forecast is what you're going to get. Really the only option is to take the average of these 2 points. As you go through some of these other products though, you're seeing these flat lines pretty consistently, and that really is because each of these individual SKUs does not have enough data to support anything except this flat line forecast. And that means that if we look at the group level forecast, this is also a terrible forecast. You see this strong seasonality in the data, and that's not at all reflected in the forecast. What is the alternative? Well, top-down forecasting is certainly an excellent choice here. And what top-down forecasting does is, instead of using the aggregated up end item forecast, it uses the demand history for cough syrups to generate a forecast. And I'm going to go ahead and do that now. and that looks like a much better forecast. And then to make sure that everything adds up correctly, what Forecast Pro is going to do is it's going to push down this forecast to the SKUs. It's going to allocate it to the SKUs so that when you add up the SKU level forecast, it's going to actually equal what this red line is here. If we actually look at the SKU level forecast, you can see clearly we have a much better forecast at this group level. But if we look at the SKU level forecast, these are also much better forecasts now. Where we had flat forecasts before, we now are reflecting the seasonality that we really know should be in these SKU level forecasts as well as in the group level forecasts. So let's go back to the slides. Another great approach for replacement products is custom component models, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric to talk about those.
Thank you, Sarah. What are custom component models and how do they help us? So custom component models are actually useful not only for new product forecasting, but also for other applications as well. The concept here is that there are different components to the forecast, things like level, trends, seasonal patterns, and that you can either fit them from the data or customize them. It can be useful in a variety of circumstances. One is when some of the components cannot be easily extrapolated. So for example, when we're generating a very long forecast, often the trends are too simplistic and you might want to customize that trend. When the data are very short, obviously that's why they're part of this webinar, because it can be used with short data sets. They can also be used when you need to model events that have not occurred historically. We'll flesh that out, but let's jump right into an example and see how this works. And this screen is doing something that I often tell people not to do, which is to forecast based on past history 5 years into the future. Okay, so this is a very long forecast. It's monthly data. It's demand for installations of telephone systems. Notice that the trend is a linear trend, and it just sort of says that this current growth is going to continue for 5 years. That's unlikely. So maybe I want to adjust that. And so let's see how a custom component model will do that. So I'm going to click on the custom component button. It brings up this dialog box. And custom component is sort of an extension of exponential smoothing. And whereas smoothing has components, so does this model. It has a starting point. That's where we begin the forecast. So that'd be right about here. It has a trend, and I'm going to hit apply, and Forecast Pro will show you this underlying trend, which at this point is a linear trend that's been generated automatically. And you can see the red line, the forecast here, is also seasonal. And so you see the seasonal component is shown up here in the form of these seasonal indices, one for each month. There's also the ability, although this example we're not doing it, to include events. So those who are familiar with event modeling, this can also be a component in a custom component model. But the main concept here is notice that I haven't customized anything at this point. I just pushed an apply button, and it has, from the data, estimated the starting point, the trend, and the seasonal pattern. So it's done that, again, using the historic demand data. Now, let's say that I want to customize the trend. So I can go in here under trend, and rather than doing linear automatic, I can choose an alternative trend. So let's do a bent custom trend. What I'm saying is, we've talked about this 5-year projection. We've decided it's overly aggressive, and we want to bend that trend a little bit. We want to slow it down. When we're talking about a new product, we often talk about what's called the launch horizon. How far are we forecasting? There's often we're going to be considering something called a launch total, which is during our launch horizon, what's the total forecast that we're estimating? When you make adjustments in a custom component model, you can use horizons and totals, and that's what we're going to do now. So notice that one of the things I have here is an option that says total forecast. And right now, the total forecast for this 5 years, the total forecast is 5,305,000 units. If we've sat around and said, no, for the 5 year, we want to lower that. That's too aggressive. So I'm going to change that. And I'm going to customize this component and make it 4,500,000. And that'll generate a different forecast. You can see that we have bent the trend, dampened the trend, but we've kept all the other components. It still has the seasonal component, still the same starting point, etc. So this is the concept between the custom component model. So how does this help us with new products? And it turns out that this is a very useful technique for new products because there are times where some of the components you're not going to be able to get from the demand history. I'm going to go into, I have another little example set up. It's the same data, but now I'm going to deal with just a 12-month period. So we're only forecasting 12 months ahead. In addition to this total figure, we introduced a new region, and there's only 3 months worth of history here. So this is a new product. Forecast Pro has generated a forecast using expert selection. And with 3 data points, it basically takes a moving average, and that's what we're looking at. So this is not a good forecast. I know that this is telephone installations. I know it's seasonal, and our forecast is not seasonal. I know that the other regions are all trending upwards, and this one is not. So the forecast is unacceptable, and I'm going to use a custom component model to make some changes. So I'll click on the custom component model icon, and I'm going to make some changes. So first I hit apply, and that builds the custom component model using the data, in this case 3 data points. Notice that because there's only 3 data points, it did not automatically come up with a seasonal pattern. So our seasonal component was automatic, but it didn't have enough data to build it. This is a problem because we know it's seasonal. So what do? I would need to customize it. I could customize it by bringing up a list of the indices, and I could type in new values. So that's one way of doing it. However, there's a simpler way, and that is to use one that I've already set up. And in fact, what I did was to take the seasonal indices from total sales of the installation and create what's called a helper variable, which I can just specify in Forecast Pro. And Forecast Pro gives you a very easy way of generating these seasonal indices and creating these helper variables. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And now you'll notice all these indices are populated. And if I hit apply, our forecast is now seasonal. So we're now capturing the seasonal component, but we are not capturing any sort of projection for a trend. And we know, again, that telephone installations are actually growing. So I need to customize the trend as well. So I'll click on our icon again. The current trend is automatic, and I'm going to change that. I'm going to do a linear trend, but customize it. And again, there are different ways I could do this. This time I'm going to just adjust the slope directly, and I'll put in a value of, say, 750 units a month. And notice that now we include a trend to our forecast as well. So this is just an example of using a custom component model for a new product, in this case, a new region that was opened up. And the custom component model here can be used very effectively in this circumstance. Okay, so let's jump back to our slides. Now, that brings us to our next category of new products, which is new to company. Okay, so what we're going to do is now look at methods that might be appropriate when we're dealing with something that's new to the company. So obviously, if it's new to the company, you're not going to have internal data of previous sales. On the other hand, we might have external data that could be available and could be relevant. What type of approaches can we use? Well, judgment and market research. That's basically going to be always true for new product forecasting, custom component models. And now we have something new. We can do assumption-based models. Assumption-based models are often used for products with long development cycles, and they are often used prior to the product launch. The industry where I've seen the most assumption-based models used is pharmaceutical forecasting for new products that are under development. The forecast is the result of a set of assumptions. And this is very often done in Excel. It is not part of Forecast Pro, but I'll be showing you a simple example of how to do it in Excel. The key to an assumption-based model is that we make a set of assumptions, it generates a forecast based on the assumptions, and then we revisit those assumptions and we say, are they still valid, or do we need to change the assumptions? The assumptions can be changed and that will change the forecast, but we never change the forecast directly. We don't just say, how much do we think we're going to sell now that we know a little more about how the development's been going? It's like, no, how did the assumptions change? And that will generate the forecast. So let's see how this works. We certainly have some pharmaceutical people here, and you'll have to forgive me for coming up with really an extremely simplistic version of this, but I'm just really trying to get across some of the ideas as opposed to building a real model. But let's see how this simple model works. I have generated a list of 7 assumptions, which leads me to a profit and loss forecast for the first year and for subsequent years. So what are my assumptions? Assumption number 1 is that it's going to take 24 months to develop this drug. And that assumption plays into what my perceived development cost is going to be, which I've put in here as 60 million. To launch the drug, we're going to need the approval of the Food and Drug Administration. And so I put an assumption of that approval, of gaining that approval at 80%. There's a certain patient population that could benefit from the drug therapy. I've put that in as 500,000. There are other drugs that can address this, and I've put our market share assumption as 35%. I've said that annual treatment in terms of revenue for a patient would be $450, and our cost of goods would be $10. And if all of these assumptions lead me to the conclusion that in the first year, we can actually get all of our development costs back and show a small profit. After that, we're hugely profitable, and going forward, we can expect a profit of 61 million in subsequent years. How do you use the model? Well, we greenlight the project, so the development begins. We now set up times for periodic review. Sometimes these are called gates. And the idea is we're going to come back, we're going to look at our assumptions at predefined time points, and we're going to say, given where we are, do we need to make any changes to our assumptions? So let's say the first gate is 6 months after we begin development, and we look at our assumptions and we say, well, you know, we had some problems setting up the lab, we couldn't get the scientists that we wanted, so we're behind schedule a little bit. And our assumption that our development time frame was going to be 24 months, I think we need to adjust that. Let's make it 30. So we change that assumption, and that changes our forecast. It changes our development costs. And now when we look down to our forecast, which had been for a small profit at the first year of launch, we're showing a loss of 13.4 million. On the other hand, the next year, the following year, we are showing a very substantial profit of this 61 million. And so at our first gate, we've adjusted one of the assumptions. We have a new forecast. We have our meeting and we say, yeah, it's not going to be quite as profitable the first year. On the other hand, everything still looks good. Let's continue. So now we come to the next gate. So maybe this is 6 months later. And now we look at this and we say, this has not gone as well as we thought. There's been some side effects of the drug, and we now think that the chance of approval is no longer 80%. And in fact, we're going to revise that downward. We're going to say the chance of approval is 40%. And furthermore, because we're now saying that a certain fraction of the patient population may have side effects, we think our market share should also be revised downward. And rather than that 35% market share assumption, we think 20% is now more realistic. Now, we've changed a couple of our assumptions and it's changed our forecast. And at this point, what we're showing is 2 different things. One is that the first year loss here is 57 million, so a very substantial amount of money. Furthermore, on subsequent years, we're showing a profit, but nowhere near the 61 million that we had previously. So at this point, there's a real question of whether we'd pass through the gate. whether we would continue with the development process now that it doesn't look quite as optimistic, or we say, no, at this point, we should take our resources and stop development of this drug and work on something that's more promising and potentially more profitable. So again, this is a very, very simple example. It's meant to get across a couple of ideas. And the ideas are that we set up a set of assumptions. This leads to a forecast. We set up points where we will review the assumptions. And then as we review the assumptions, if we make changes, it changes our forecast. And then we decide whether we continue or not, whether we pass through the gate. So this is assumption-based modeling. Let's go back to our slides. And the next thing we're going to consider is market share forecasting. And so I'm going to turn this over to Sarah Darren, and she will enlighten us on market share forecasting.
Thank you, Eric. So market share forecasting. Market share forecasting is a straightforward idea. And the idea is that when entering a new market, organizations will often focus on market share instead of just unit sales. And you actually saw that in the assumption-based model example that Eric went through. Market share was an input into that particular model. But because there's no internal data, because the company is new to the market, companies may need to do some market research to come up with reasonable estimates of market share. And there are lots of companies out there to help, places like Nielsen and IRI. And these companies can provide a lot of insight into both the size of the current market, its composition, and really provide some good inputs into what a projected market share could be. They often even do custom research, so things like conjoint analysis or discrete choice analysis, or even focus groups, to really understand how well this new potential player in the market might resonate with potential consumers. And once you have that market share estimate, it really does translate into a unit forecast pretty easily, again, as we saw in the assumption-based model example. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Eric to talk about forecasting by analogy.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah. Forecasting by analogy, some people also call it look-like analysis. The basic idea is that you have a shape or a pattern that you think the product launch will look like, so the initial demand. And we call that pattern a launch profile. And we'll see an example in just a minute, and that'll make more sense. It can be used with or without historic data. So it's something we can do pre-launch, or we can also do it as the data come in. And this is really the heart of this. And you can do this on a spreadsheet. It is built into Forecast Pro, but conceptually, this spreadsheet sort of shows us how it works. First of all, over here, we have the analogy series. And the shape of this is what I call the launch profile. This is what we expect when we launch the new product. And you can see we expect it for the first couple of months to go up very sharply. Maybe this is filling up our pipeline. Then we've got to drop it down, and then we go into some sort of longer term behavior. So this would be based on products that we think are similar. And again, this is the shape which we think our product launch is going to look at. The analogy series is shown here in column B, and it's shown for a certain period of time. And that period of time, in this case, is 12 months. And that's what we're going to call our launch horizon. The analogy series gives us the shape, and this is just the values from the analogy series. But notice I can take that and say that the first month, we sold 4.2% of the total volume for the first year. In the second month, it was 12.7%, and in the third, 14.9%, et cetera. The relative percentages are saying over our launch horizon of 12 months, what percent fell in the first month, the second month, the third month, et cetera. Column D is the cumulative relative percent, and it's saying, for example, that in the first 3 months, we sold 31.8%. And this is how we generate forecasts when we forecast by analogy, is by leveraging these relative percentage and the cumulative relative percentages. Let's do an example and see how this actually works. And as I mentioned, Forecast by analogy can be used prior to the product launch, or it can be used after we have some data. So in this, I'm going to show both ways, and I'm going to start with prior to the product launch. Notice that there is no historic data on this graph. The data haven't started yet. If you put in let's call it a null product into Forecast Pro, it's going to generate a forecast of all zeros as a starting point. But again, we'll use a forecast by analogy to enforce our product profile. So it does require that you bring in a product profile, and I've got a couple down here under the helpers section, including this one, which is the one we're going to use. Okay, but this is the shape that we expect to see, that the first month, we've got a great big increase as we fill our pipeline. It then tapers off from there. How do we do it with no data? So let's take a look. I'm going to go and choose by analogy, and that brings up this little dialog box. And first thing I have to do is to choose the profile, which is profile 1. And if you're using it without data, you're going to have to give it a specified launch total. You're going to have to say, okay, we're looking out 12, our launch horizon is 12 months, and how much are we going to sell during that 12 months? It's a new product launch, you've had market research, you maybe have other forms of input, but we've come up with an assumption. For this assumption, our market research says our specified launch total should be 500,000 units in the first 12 months. So I've put that in, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And here's our forecast. Notice it has that shape. Okay, so it has the same shape as the profile. If we were to sum up the forecast, what you would find is that the sum is now 500,000 units. We use those relative percentages. You told us we want 500,000 units in 12 months, and we know what percent goes into each period, and so it's very straightforward to construct these forecasts. So when you use it without data, you need to put in the total, the expected launch total. Now, what if we have some data? So that's this example here. I have 3 data points, so we're 3 months into the launch. Notice it went up that first one, and now it's coming down, which is similar to what we expected. The default in Forecast Pro, if you forecast 3 data points, it's probably going to use something like a moving average, and we've got a forecast that is not related to our expected launch profile. So I'm going to choose by analogy. I'm going to choose profile 1. I'm going to set the launch horizon to 12, and let's specify the launch total on our original expectation of 500,000 units. Here's our forecast, and I'm going to add to this what's called the fitted values. So the green line is what we actually sold in the first 3 months. The red line here is the fitted. It's what we expected to sell if we were going to sell 500,000 units. And notice there's a big difference here. We have not sold nearly as much as the expectation on this first 3 months. What we would do here, if this was the case, is we'd have a discussion as to what's going on. Perhaps, we could only launch in one region. We're actually still in good shape. No, we didn't hit this, but because we're rolling out the regions differently, we're expecting to pick up a lot more volume. Or the answer is no, this just is not gaining the traction that we thought it would. We think our 500,000 probably is not realistic. To get to next month's forecast, we'd actually have to increase, and we've already peaked. So the outcome of this meeting might be our initial projection of 500,000 is not realistic given that we're 3 months into it and we're not hitting the numbers. So let's go back to the by analogy. We've specified the launch total of 500,000. Notice there's an estimated launch total. You're 3 months into it. And from our chart, we know that in the first 3 months, we expected to sell about 32% of the first year's volume. If that's 32% is what we sold, then how much are we going to sell over the total launch horizon? And rather than using the specified total, we're going to use the estimated total. So it's saying, yeah, your market research said 500,000, but now that we're 3 months into it, it looks more like 365,000. So let's hit OK here. Notice that with the assumption that we're going to sell 365,000, we're right on target to do that because we're actually now using the historic data to estimate where we're going to end. So again, this is just an example, but we wanted to show it both ways. Pre-launch, you need to come up with the launch total, and post-launch, you can either continue to use a specified total, or you can look at the data that's come in and get an estimated total and get a feel for how you're tracking. Okay, with that, let's go back to the slides. So that brings us to new to the world. And we'll have Sarah help us out with that.
Thank you, Eric. So we have in fact saved the hardest for the last. New to world forecasting is the most challenging of all. That said, there are approaches. Judgment and market research are going to be very helpful and very needed. In terms of market research, you'll probably have to do some primary market research to understand how well the product that you want to introduce to the world really resonates with a potential market. We also have assumption-based models. Assumption-based models are really a good approach when there's a lot of risk associated with the product launch, and that's certainly going to be the case for a new-to-world product launch. Forecasting by analogy. While you don't have analogous products in your market that you can use as a series, you do have the ability to look at prior new-to-world product launches that might have a similar initial demand pattern. Custom component model. You can use a custom component model to perhaps put seasonality onto a market research generated market share. Diffusion models. This is a new one. The BAS diffusion model is the most commonly known diffusion model, and it's very commonly used in marketing applications. The BAS model is used to forecast first-time adoptions of new-to-world products, so not total sales. It captures the adoption rates of what we call innovators and imitators. Imitators are people who get really excited about new technology and they want to be the first ones to get their hands on it. Imitators are a little bit more cautious. They want to wait and see how well the technology works before they try it out. For example, think about Microsoft Windows launch, a new Microsoft Windows version. There are going to be people who want to get their hands on it and really start playing with it immediately, and those are like the innovators. And then there are other people who really want to wait until all the wrinkles are ironed out, all the bugs are identified before they're willing to try it out. That dynamic is intuitively appealing and it makes sense, and it's one of the reasons why people like the BAS model. Another good thing about the BAS model is that it can be used with or without historic demand data. The problem here, though, is if you don't have historic demand data, you need to rely on judgment, and coming up with the right parameters to use can be really challenging. So let's take a look at what those parameters are. So there are three key parameters to estimate a BAS model in Forecast Pro. We have the coefficient of innovation, which we call P, and this is the rate at which innovators adopt new technology. Q is the coefficient of imitation and captures the rate at which imitators are adopting the new product. Then we have M, which is the total potential market. And like with assumption-based models, this is something which market research is going to be very helpful for informing what the total potential market might be. So as I already mentioned, if you don't have historic data, you can set these parameters judgmentally. If you do have historic data, once you have 5 data points, you can use that data to estimate the parameters. There is a considerable body of literature on what coefficients you should use if you don't have any data, and those differ quite widely for different types of technologies. And the choices have a really big impact on what your forecast is going to be. So before a launch, it's really difficult to come up with the right coefficients. Once the launch has happened, you estimate those coefficients, and it looks like the forecast is really tight. It's really close to what happened, but you don't know those coefficients to generate that forecast until after the launch. And at that point, it's not useful. So Dan, let's summarize everything we've talked about here today. The type of new product will often dictate the approach. Judgment and market research play a really important role in all of these approaches. And doing good market research is going to be a cornerstone of a good product launch. When forecasting replacement products, you really should leverage the data for the predecessor products by, for example, using product mapping to map the predecessor product demand history into your new product, or by using top-down approaches. When forecasting new to company or new to world, you can leverage experience with similar products in the same market for new to company, or for new to world, you can look within the same technology realm and understand how other new to world product launches have played out. You want to do a lot of market research to understand how much appeal, how much demand there might be for your product. That market research can inform then maybe an assumption-based model or a Bass diffusion model. Here we have a convenient reference book by Ken Kahn, New Product Forecasting. It is it's a very good text. It's only about 100 pages. It's very accessible, and it gives a good overview of a lot of the new product methodologies we've talked about here today. So now Eric is quickly going to take us through some upcoming events, and then we will move on to questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, before we get to the Q&A, I would like to take a minute or two and tell you about some upcoming events. Also want to remind you that we have recorded today's session and we'll be posting it online for streaming. And you'll get an email probably in sometime next week once it's been posted and is ready for viewing. Our next webinar is actually part of our Succeeding with Forecast Pro series. This is presentations that talk about using Forecast Pro, and the next one is about item comments and statuses. And these are some new features that we've put into Forecast Pro that allow you to use threaded comments to communicate and collaborate with people that you're working with, and also assignable statuses. So as you're reviewing your forecast, you can mark what sort of status and progresses that you've made. The presentation will be presented by James Berry, who is our Director of Training here at Forecast Pro, and you can go to the website and sign up if you're interested. We also have 2 online workshops scheduled, one in July and one in December. These are always fun events. They're 3 days. We've got about 4.5 hours each day, and we cover different forecasting techniques with a real emphasis on conceptually how they work and how they're applied to real data. It's also a very interactive class, so people turn on their webcams and their microphones, and there's lots of sort of back and forth to ask questions and clarify things. So if you haven't attended one and you're interested, visit the website. We'd love to have you participate. And then finally, I wanted to mention that throughout today's webinar, we've been using the Forecast Pro software. And if you are interested in learning more about Forecast Pro, we would love to enlighten you. And probably the best way to do that is to schedule a live remote-based demo. And if you're interested in that, you can actually put a message in the chat box and we'll have one of our salespeople get back to you and schedule that. If you're not quite ready for a demo, you can also visit the website. There's a lot of good information there, and you can download a trial version if you want to experiment with Forecast Pro and learn more about it. But by all means, if you're interested, let us know, and we'd love to tell you more.
Okay, so at this point, I think I'll put my webcam back on here. But we've come to the Q&A portion. And Sabina, do do we have any questions?
Yeah, so we got quite a few questions. So just a reminder, if we don't get to them during this session, we'll follow up with an email. But the first question that came in, they asked, in top-down, how's the total disaggregated to the member SKUs?
Okay, so.
I can take that one.
Okay.
So, excellent question, and one that we do really get into the details of that in one of the webinars that we've done previously on hierarchical modeling. So that is available in our webinar archive. So if you want a really detailed answer, that's a great thing to look at. But the short answer is we do it by time period. So for each time period, we'll take the group level forecast, and we've also forecasted at the end item. So we have end item forecasts. We use those end item forecasts to allocate. So for example, if you had 2 items, really simple example, 2 end items that had a forecast, 1 of 1, 1 of 3, we would allocate 25% of the group level forecast to the item with the 1 forecast, and the other 75% to the other item.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add a little bit to that. So Sarah is describing the way we do it in Forecast Pro. And again, the key elements there is that we're doing it for each forecast period. So the first forecast period, we're looking at the total forecast, the component forecast, and we're making that proportional allocation. Then we look at the second period forecast, we do the same thing. So that's the way Forecast Pro does it. Other systems do top-down forecasting as well. And if you look at, but they all kind of vary in how they do it. It is very common to not do it in the forecast period, but to just look at historic proportions and use that as the basis for the allocation. To me, this is a subpar way of doing it. It doesn't preserve the trends that you're forecasting. So if some of the items are trended upwards and some are trended downwards, by doing it period by period, you're capturing that movement. You're getting more and more allocated to the ones that are growing and less to the ones that are waning. But again, what we're describing here is the way Forecast Pro does it. I do think it's best practices. If you're doing this kind of reconciliation in another software, or if you're building it on your own, it's not the only way that it's done, but again, we recommend it as best practice. So Sabina, we have other questions?
Yeah, the next question they asked, what's the time range of a long development cycle?
Okay, so like people who have seen me or attended a workshop with me will know that my favorite answer, bar none, is it depends, okay? So most things in forecasting, it does depend, and it's relative. So in terms of when we did the assumption-based modeling, we talked about a long-term forecast, or long-term development cycle, I should say. And the arena where assumption-based modeling is most prevalent is the pharmaceutical arena. That's where you see it used a lot. So what's a long development cycle, or what's a typical development cycle for a new drug? Well, it's tempting to make all the examples use COVID, because for the last year and a half, that's all anybody has been talking about. But it's a reasonable thing. The COVID vaccine was an incredibly short development cycle for a vaccine, okay? But it still took, what, a year and a half to get there. The approval process was rushed, okay? And it was actually it was authorized on an emergency use basis in the United States before it received formal approval. So again, I would say that's a short development cycle for something like a vaccine, but it still encompassed several years. And in normal times, if it wasn't such a mission critical, then taking 4, 5, 6 years to develop a new drug therapy is pretty common. On the other hand, if you're not in that arena, how long does it take to develop, you know, a new product in, say, for consumer packaged goods? That's going to vary, but it'd be much shorter. You know, usually you're not spending 5 or 6 years to come up with the new and improved version. So again, I think that that's one where you have to look at what industry am I in, what is the product that we're looking at. But I think the key, hearkening back to the assumption-based models, the key with that is the gates. It's when you're saying, depending on how the development goes, we may or may not want to continue. And it's very hard for an organization to spend a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of money trying to develop a new product. And then when things aren't going so well, to pull the plug, to say, no, we can't pass through that gate. It's, you know, we need to switch and put our development money into something else. And that's, the gates are really the part to the assumption-based model that they offer a way of making very difficult assumptions, but thinking about them before you get started. It's one of its real strengths. Other questions?
The last question asked, how does it work with several units? And by that, they mean if low level are in pieces and SKUs have various sizes, how can you correctly do a cumulative top-down forecast?
Yeah, I can, another top-down one. So I think what this person is asking is, if you have a SKU that's, say, 8 ounces and a SKU that's 16 ounces, how do you combine them into a single unit? And that's a really good question. And because it is something that when you're setting up a hierarchy, you need to think through how you're measuring everything and whether it makes sense to add together items up into a group total and then to model that group total. So that's one of the things that you want to think about when you're setting up your data. In the cough syrup example, it was actually pallets. That it was kind of a how many pallets should we be shipping type of question. So in that case, it was pretty equivalent and easy to add those pallets up into a group total. But in a lot of different industries, basically things are equivalized. So we do a lot of stuff with beer. You might have seen us use beer data in some of these webinars as well. So for beer, things are often just measured in some volume. So like kegs, barrels, etc. In Nielsen, all clients who are generating these databases with all of their data are always going to find something called an EQU, equivalized unit, so that you can add up against multiple SKUs and have it make sense. So good question, because it really is something that you need to think about and make sure that how you're measuring is making sense if you're adding across multiple things.
Yeah. So again, just reiterating what Sarah's saying, forecasting the number of 6-packs we sold and adding it to the number of 12-packs we sold does not make any sense. That's the total, just doesn't make sense. On the other hand, forecasting how many gallons of beer we sold in 6-packs plus how many gallons of beer we sold in 12-packs makes perfect sense. The total is now the number of gallons of beer that we need to produce and then the packaging is secondary. So again, good question. Glad we clarified that. That does bring us to the end of our webinar. I want to thank everybody for taking an hour out of your day and joining us. I hope you found it useful. And this is a quarterly series, so we'll be scheduling our next webinar in the not too distant future. And by attending this one, among other things, you'll be on our mailing list and you will get an invitation once we choose a topic and schedule a time. So hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for coming. See you.